I spent my entire weekend rewriting security patches to keep our systems from crashing, only to be told my wool suit killed the aesthetic at our $3.5 billion valuation meeting. They wanted me silent in the corner while they sold empty buzzwords to Seattle's most ruthless investor. But those silver spoon executives forgot one fatal detail. I built this digital empire, and I know exactly which brick to pull to bring the whole thing crumbling down. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories, where we bring you the most satisfying tales of corporate justice. Sadly, our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating and pay our hardworking staff. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or comments, so we can continue creating these videos for you. My name is Brooke Bryant. I am 38 years old, and for the past 12 years, I have been the lead systems engineer at Cryptexa Core. We are a software company in Seattle that looks like every other glossy glass-walled darling of the digital era. We have the ping-pong tables, the expensive cold brew on tap, and the endless rhetoric about changing the human experience. But behind those frosted doors, the reality is far less glamorous. The entire corporate structure is a fragile house of cards held together by duct tape and my own chronic sleep deprivation. Today was the day of the ultimate reckoning. We were exactly 1 hour away from a life-or-death acquisition meeting. The valuation on the table was a staggering $3.5 billion. The man sitting on the other side of that mahogany table would be Julian Cross. Julian was a corporate apex predator. He was a ruthless buyout mogul famous for gutting failing tech companies, stripping them down to their proprietary patents, and coldly discarding the useless executives. The air in our boardroom was already suffocating under the weight of impending doom and the desperate greed of our leadership. I was standing near the head of the conference table, doing a final diagnostic check on the local network latency. That was exactly when Kinsley Prescott decided to make her grand entrance. Kinsley was 24 years old, holding the entirely fabricated title of Chief Brand Manager. She also happened to be the biological niece of our Chief Executive Officer. While the engineering team had been preparing for a financial war, Kinsley was dressed like she was attending Paris Fashion Week. She wore a shimmering metallic silver blazer draped over a white silk top, paired with dangerously high stilettos that clicked obnoxiously against the concrete floor. She stopped a few feet away from me, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with an exaggerated sigh. She made sure the gaggle of newly hired marketing assistants were gathered behind her, ready to act as her laugh track. "Brooke, seriously?" Kinsley drawled, her voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You are wearing that to a meeting with Julian Cross. You look like an outdated librarian. You are completely ruining the Silicon Valley vibe we are trying to project here." The marketing assistants obligingly covered their mouths, stifling their giggles. I looked down at my simple, impeccably clean navy blue wool suit. It was not flashy, but it was professional, and vastly more importantly, it was the only clean piece of clothing I had left in my office closet. I stared back into Kinsley's perfectly contoured face, and I chose absolute silence. I did not waste my breath explaining that this practical suit was my only option, because I had just spent the last 72 hours fully awake. I had pulled 3 consecutive all-nighters locked inside the freezing server room, manually rewriting security patches just to keep the company's core network from crashing. While Kinsley was getting her morning blowout, I was the only pillar preventing her $3.5 billion mirage from evaporating. So, I just looked at her, keeping my expression entirely flat, letting the heavy silence stretch out until it became distinctly uncomfortable. Before Kinsley could launch another remark, the heavy oak doors swung open. Arthur Prescott, our Chief Executive Officer, marched into the room. Arthur was a weak man who sweated profusely whenever the market fluctuated. Today, he was practically vibrating with frantic energy, his face flushed red and his smile aggressively fake. I stepped forward, holding out a thick binder containing the actual system architecture schematics and the real back-end operational metrics that Julian Cross would undoubtedly demand to see. Here are the core technical reports. Arthur, I said evenly, we need to be fully transparent about the bandwidth limitations. Arthur did not even break his rapid stride. He violently batted my heavy binder aside. It hit the slick surface of the table with a loud thud. We are absolutely not boring him with that dense technical garbage today. Brooke, Arthur hissed, leaning in close so only I could smell his expensive cologne and hear the panic vibrating in his voice. This is a vision pitch. We are selling him the future, not a depressing spreadsheet. You take those miserable files, and you sit in that chair right over there in the dark corner. He pointed a trembling finger toward a small stool stationed behind the primary projection screen. You do not speak. You do not make eye contact. You sit in the corner. You keep your mouth firmly shut, and you click the slide transition button exactly when Kinsley cues you. Do you understand me? I looked at my discarded binder, then up at Arthur's sweating face, and finally over at Kinsley, who was smirking triumphantly. I gave a slow nod. I picked up my binder, walked quietly over to the designated corner, and sat down in the shadows. They wanted a silent puppet. They wanted to bury their catastrophic incompetence under trendy buzzwords. Let them. They had entirely forgotten that I was the one who built this digital empire, and I knew exactly which brick to pull to bring the whole miserable thing down. Precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy double doors swung open. Julian Cross did not merely walk into a room. He occupied it. He displaced the oxygen the way a sinking ship displaces water. He was flanked by 2 senior analysts who looked like corporate undertakers, both dressed in identical, severely tailored charcoal suits. Julian himself wore a bespoke dark suit, but it was his eyes that truly commanded the space. They were a flat, unforgiving gray, devoid of any warmth or basic human empathy. He did not offer any pleasantries. There were no handshakes. There was no polite small talk about the weather. Arthur practically leapt out of his ergonomic leather chair. A sweaty hand extended in a desperate greeting that went entirely ignored. Julian glided right past him. He chose a seat directly in the center of the long table, the position of maximum authority, and placed a single, unremarkable leather-bound notepad in front of him. His 2 analysts sat down simultaneously, opening their high-end laptops with synchronized, intimidating clicks. The silence in the boardroom stretched so incredibly tight that I thought it might actually shatter the expensive glass walls enclosing us. From my designated dark corner, I gripped the small plastic presentation clicker tightly in my right hand. Kinsley stepped up to the head of the table. She offered a practiced smile that looked more like a painful grimace under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. She began her critical pitch by aggressively signaling her assistants to distribute sleek, heavy white virtual reality headsets to every single person sitting at the table. She instructed the potential buyers to put the devices on so they could fully immerse themselves in our vision. As I pressed the button to advance to the first slide, flooding the main projection screen with brightly colored, neon graphics, Kinsley launched into her heavily rehearsed monologue. She spoke passionately and loudly about cultivating a vibrant, self-sustaining tech ecosystem. She used grand hand gestures while discussing how we were leveraging community energy and aggressively breaking down traditional digital barriers to empower the modern user. It was an endless flowing stream of meaningless buzzwords. It sounded incredibly impressive to naive venture capitalists, but it meant absolutely nothing to any competent professional. I watched from the shadows, pressing the transition button exactly on her visual cues, obediently advancing through dozens of slides filled with floating animated clouds and abstract webs of connectivity. Julian did not even touch the expensive virtual reality headset placed perfectly in front of him on the polished wood. He simply stared at the white device for a long, incredibly heavy moment. Then, he slowly tilted his head up to look directly at Kinsley. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, terrifyingly calm, and utterly devastating. It cut through her enthusiastic, high-volume speech about market synergies like a surgical scalpel. "Ms. Prescott," Julian said evenly, leaning back slightly in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. I am not here today to fund a contemporary digital art installation. Put the toys away. I need you to provide your core technical metrics right now. Specifically, I want to know your current server latency protocol under maximum user load, and I want a detailed explanation of how exactly you are handling the cloud data liquidity across your international operating nodes. Kinsley completely froze. The clicker in my hand hovered over the next button. But there was no cue to follow. Kinsley had abruptly stopped talking. Her designer outfit suddenly looked suffocatingly heavy on her narrow shoulders. Her smile cracked and fell away, exposing pure, unadulterated panic underneath the layers of expensive makeup. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting frantically toward Arthur, who was suddenly intensely fascinated by the fine grain of the wooden conference table. "Well," Kinsley stammered, her voice entirely losing its polished, confident resonance. "Regarding the data liquidity, we firmly believe the core strength of our brand lies in organic human connection. That is exactly why our new social media customer engagement campaign has seen a remarkable 200% increase in interactive daily touchpoints over the last financial quarter." She tried desperately to force a lighthearted laugh, gesturing vaguely toward the massive projection screen showing a pie chart of interactions. "Our community energy is currently at an all-time high, which drives our ecosystem forward." Julian did not blink. He did not smile. He simply raised one index finger into the air, a microscopic movement that instantly silenced her mid-sentence. "I did not ask you a single question about your social media campaign," Julian said, his tone dropping an entire octave, freezing the blood of everyone in the room. "I asked you about your back-end architecture. If 10 million concurrent users ping your primary server array at exactly midnight, what is your exact packet loss percentage? What is the specific failover redundancy protocol you have in place? Do not stand there and talk to me about brand engagement when I'm asking you a direct question about your physical infrastructure." Kinsley's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, resembling a fish suffocating on a dry dock. She looked desperately at Arthur once more, but he was visibly sweating through his dress shirt, offering zero verbal or moral assistance. The two cold analysts typing rapidly beside Julian paused their work, their eyes flicking up to watch the slow-motion train wreck happening at the head of the table. Julian slowly turned his head, methodically scanning the entire length of the polished boardroom table. He looked at the terrified marketing assistants who were staring intently at their shoes. He looked at Arthur, who was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard that his knuckles had turned completely white. Julian immediately recognized the absolute intellectual emptiness present in the room. He saw right through the glossy veneer directly to the hollow, rotting core of the company's leadership. "Let me rephrase the question so everyone can understand," Julian said, his voice echoing loudly in the dead, suffocating silence of the room. "Is there a single person in this room who actually understands how this machine operates?" His cold gray eyes bypassed the trembling executives. His sharp gaze swept past the panoramic views of the rainy skyline. Then, his eyes stopped moving. They locked onto the dark, forgotten corner of the room. They landed directly on me. I was the only person in the entire room who was not sweating, not shaking, and quietly writing down precise server latency figures on a yellow legal pad. At exactly midnight, under a maximum load of 10 million concurrent users, our packet loss spikes to 4.2%. I stated. My voice was completely calm, echoing clearly across the expansive boardroom. I did not need to glance at the yellow legal pad resting on my lap. I knew the system architecture blindly because I had built every single virtual bridge it relied upon. Furthermore, our failover redundancy protocol is severely bottlenecked by the legacy copper wiring housed in the secondary data center. This limits our disaster recovery speed to just under 45 seconds. The actual physical maintenance cost for this aging infrastructure is currently burning through $850,000 a month. That figure is nearly double the original projected budget. Kinsley physically lunged forward, the metallic fabric of her silver blazer flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights. She desperately plastered a rigid, terrifyingly wide smile onto her face, attempting to intercept the conversation. What our lead engineer really means to say, Mr. Cross, is that we are currently undergoing a massive, holistic systemic upgrade that will permanently streamline those minor operational inefficiencies, Kinsley said, her voice pitched unnaturally high. Brooke, thank you so much for that deeply technical deep dive, but we really need to pivot back to the core vision of our pitch right now. Julian did not shift his gaze toward Kinsley. He kept his cold, flat gray eyes locked entirely on me. Without moving his head, he slowly raised a single index finger into the air. It was a universally understood, undeniable gesture of absolute authority. Kinsley snapped her mouth shut so quickly that her teeth clicked audibly in the suffocating quiet of the room. In the dead silence that followed, my cell phone vibrated sharply against my ribs from inside my suit jacket pocket. I pulled the device out smoothly, keeping the glowing screen shielded beneath the edge of the heavy mahogany table. It was a direct, urgent text message from Arthur, who was sitting merely 12 feet away from me. The message read, "Shut your mouth right now or you are fired immediately. I will personally make sure you are permanently blacklisted from the entire tech industry." I slowly lifted my eyes from the cracked glass of my phone screen. I looked straight down the length of the table at Arthur. His face was pale and covered in a slick sheen of anxious sweat, but his eyes were wide, bulging with a toxic mixture of sheer terror and venomous rage. From Arthur. My gaze drifted down to the glossy, heavy leather-bound financial prospectus resting neatly near his trembling hands. It was the master accounting ledger he was eagerly waiting to hand over to Julian Cross to seal the deal. I knew exactly what was printed inside those crisp, thick pages. It was a meticulously crafted lie. It was a completely fabricated financial statement specifically designed to bury over $40 million in hidden toxic corporate debt. In that crystal-clear fraction of a second, the entire chaotic picture snapped into terrifying focus. Arthur and Kinsley were not just arrogant, incompetent executives drowning in their own delusions of grandeur. They were actively executing a massive, coordinated corporate fraud. More importantly, I finally understood exactly why I was the only senior technical officer they had kept on the payroll over the last 6 months. I was not there to maintain the servers or build the future. I was the designated legal scapegoat. When the external audit inevitably failed, and when their $3.5 billion house of cards finally collapsed under a federal criminal investigation, my signature would be the one permanently etched at the bottom of all the falsified technical compliance sheets. They were planning to throw me directly to the federal authorities just to save their own designer-wearing skins. I felt the cold, hard edges of my phone against my palm. A sudden, absolute calm washed over my entire body, erasing the exhaustion of the past 3 days. I had spent 12 years of my life building the solid digital foundation they currently stood upon. I was absolutely not going to let my reputation, my freedom, and my hard-earned career sink to the bottom of the ocean strapped to this burning, garbage ship. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, sat up perfectly straight in my chair, and prepared to strike back. "Let us dispense with the warm-up exercises," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "The infrastructure is evidently a disaster, but I am not looking to acquire a server farm. The singular reason my firm is sitting at this table, the sole justification for a $3.5 billion valuation, is your proprietary predictive algorithm. I want full confirmation right now regarding the intellectual property rights. Is the core code 100% owned by this entity, free and clear of any external encumbrances?" Arthur opened his mouth, his face stretching into a desperate, reassuring smile, but I did not give him the chance to utter a single syllable. I stood up from my stool in the dark corner. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, every eye tracking my movement. "We do not own a single line of that algorithm," I stated loudly. The words rang out like gunshots in the sterile room. Arthur's jaw dropped. Kinsley gasped loudly, taking a sudden step backward as if she had been physically struck. Julian simply tilted his head, his flat gray eyes remaining locked on me, waiting for the rest of the execution. The predictive engine is not proprietary, I continued, my voice steady and echoing with absolute certainty. It is entirely leased. It is licensed on a rolling basis from a third-party shell company operating out of Eastern Europe. We merely slap our user interface over their back-end architecture and pretend we built it. Arthur slammed his palms onto the mahogany table. The loud smack vibrated through the floorboards. He shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward violently and crashing into the glass wall behind him. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of crimson. "Security!" Arthur roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Get security up here, right this second. This woman is a disgruntled, rogue contractor who has completely lost her mind. I want her escorted out of my building immediately." He reached frantically for the sleek landline phone sitting in the middle of the table, but Julian moved faster. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He simply reached out and placed his large hand firmly over Arthur's trembling fingers, pinning them to the phone receiver. "If you pick up that phone, Arthur, my next call will be to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you will leave this building in handcuffs." Julian said. His tone was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the devastating weight of an absolute threat. "You will sit back down, you will shut your mouth, and you will let the engineer finish her technical report." Arthur stared into Julian's dead eyes. The fight drained out of him instantly. He collapsed back into his recovered chair, looking like a deflated balloon, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I stepped up to the edge of the polished mahogany table. I reached into the right pocket of my wool suit and pulled out a small, heavy silver flash drive. I placed it onto the smooth wood and pushed it with my index finger. The small metal drive slid across the long expanse of the table, coming to a perfect, complete stop exactly 1 inch away from Julian's leather notebook. "Since we do not own the algorithm," I explained, turning my attention completely to the investor, "we are required to pay exorbitant monthly licensing fees. However, we have missed our last 3 consecutive payments. On the 1st of next month, in exactly 14 days, our access to the core engine will be permanently locked. The entire platform will instantly become a dead, non-functional shell." Julian looked down at the silver flash drive, then back up at me. "If the company is functionally insolvent and defaulting on critical operational leases, how exactly are they funding these aggressive global marketing expansions?" "That is exactly what is contained on that drive," I said, gesturing toward the metal stick. I turned my head slowly to look directly at Kinsley. She was trembling so violently that the metallic fabric of her blazer was creating a distracting, shimmering wave. Our chief brand manager realized the marketing budget was utterly depleted. She also knew that the massive, lavish public relations campaigns and the luxury corporate retreats could not stop without raising suspicion. So, she bypassed the standard encryption protocols. Over the last 6 months, she has been secretly exporting the raw, completely unanonymized personal data of over 2 million active users. The room went entirely still. Even the 2 robotic analysts sitting next to Julian stopped typing, their hands hovering frozen over their keyboards. Selling user data was unethical. Selling raw, unanonymized data containing financial profiles and private identities was a massive federal crime. She sold it in bulk to an offshore data broker, I concluded mercilessly. She traded the privacy and security of 2 million people to artificially inflate the quarterly revenue, solely to cover the massive deficit caused by her completely wasteful aesthetic vanity projects. Kinsley finally snapped. The sheer weight of the exposure shattered her carefully curated facade. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that bounced off the glass walls. Tears streamed down her face, dragging thick streaks of black mascara and expensive foundation down her cheeks. You are lying," Kinsley screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "You are just a bitter, miserable loser. You have always been insanely jealous of me. You are jealous of my vision. You are jealous of my beauty. And you are jealous because you are just a sad, ugly nobody who lives in a dark basement." She slammed her hands against the table. sobbing loudly, entirely abandoning any pretense of professionalism. "You ruined everything. You ruined my entire life because you do not understand the aesthetic of modern business." Julian did not even blink at her explosive outburst. He acted as if a small, annoying insect was buzzing somewhere in the room. He calmly picked up the silver flash drive, sliding it smoothly into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket. Then, he methodically flipped his leather notebook shut. The soft thud of the cover closing sounded like a judge bringing down a final, damning gavel. Julian slowly stood up, buttoning his jacket with practiced, effortless precision. His two analysts instantly mirrored his movements, closing their laptops and standing in perfect unison. Julian looked down at Arthur, who was staring blankly at the tabletop, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending legal destruction. "I have gutted hundreds of failing companies in my career." "Arthur," Julian said, his voice ringing with absolute, clinical disdain. "I have dealt with incompetence. I have dealt with stupidity, but I draw a very strict line at criminal fraud. I will not pay a single, solitary cent for a hollow, fraudulent enterprise operated by a thief and a screaming child." Without waiting for a response, Julian turned his back on the executives. He walked toward the heavy double doors, his analysts flanking him in perfect silence. They exited the boardroom without looking back, leaving the doors wide open behind them. The $3.5 billion mirage had officially evaporated, leaving Arthur and Kinsley sitting entirely alone in the wreckage of their shattered careers. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and for exactly 3 seconds, the boardroom was entirely silent. The quiet was so absolute that I could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of Kinsley from across the room. Then, the silence shattered. Arthur let out a primal, guttural roar that tore from his throat. He grabbed the nearest heavy leather chair and hurled it violently against the glass wall. The reinforced pane spiderwebbed with a sickening crack. He turned his rage toward the long table, sweeping his arms across the polished wood, sending the expensive white virtual reality headsets, water pitchers, and thick binders crashing to the floor in a chaotic cascade of plastic and breaking glass. You are done," Arthur screamed, his voice breaking as he marched toward me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. "You are completely finished in this town. Brooke, you are fired right here, right now. This very second, do not even think about asking for your accrued vacation time. You are getting absolutely zero severance pay. I will personally make it my life's mission to ensure you never touch a keyboard in this industry again." He frantically grabbed the landline phone, the same one Julian had stopped him from using minutes earlier, and slammed his hand repeatedly on the 0 button to reach the front desk. He loudly demanded that the building security team come up to the executive suite immediately. Within 2 minutes, 2 massive security guards stepped into the destroyed boardroom. They looked bewildered by the shattered glass and overturned chairs. But Arthur simply pointed a shaking finger at me. He ordered them to escort me to my desk and march me out of the building like a common trespasser. As the guards stepped forward, Kinsley pushed herself up from the table. Her face was still a disastrous canvas of smeared mascara and ruined foundation, but the pure terror from earlier had morphed into a venomous, spiteful satisfaction. She wiped her wet cheek with the back of her trembling hand and offered me a broken, ugly smirk. "You think you won something today?" Kinsley hissed, her voice dripping with pure malice as the large guards flanked my sides. "I know people everywhere. I have thousands of industry connections. I will completely destroy your reputation before you even make it to the parking garage. You will be begging for a minimum wage job by next week." I did not give her the satisfaction of a response. I turned my back on both of them and began the long, humiliating walk down the central corridor, closely shadowed by the 2 men in uniform. The open-plan office, usually buzzing with the artificial energy of ping-pong games and espresso machines, was deathly quiet. Dozens of heads popped up from behind their monitors, watching me with wide, whispering eyes as I was marched toward the engineering department. When I reached my small, windowless office, one of the guards handed me a single, flat cardboard box. I stood there, looking at the tiny space where I had spent the last 12 years of my life, 12 years of missing holidays, working through the night, and pouring my absolute soul into keeping their digital infrastructure alive. And it all fit into one pathetic box. I moved slowly, mechanically. I carefully unplugged my personal mechanical keyboard. I took down the small, faded photograph of my dog. I grabbed my favorite ceramic coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that had survived hundreds of late-night debugging sessions. There was no grand farewell. There were no final human resources documents to sign. I just packed my sparse memories, tucked my wool suit jacket tightly around my shoulders, and carried the light box toward the elevator. When I finally stepped through the revolving glass doors of the lobby and out onto the street, the heavy reality of the situation hit me. The sky was a bruised, oppressive gray, and a freezing, relentless Seattle drizzle was falling sideways, driven by a bitter wind. The damp cold bit through my suit instantly. I stood on the wet concrete sidewalk, holding my cardboard box, and felt a massive, suffocating wave of panic wash over me. I was 38 years old, suddenly unemployed, with a massive mortgage hanging over my head. I had exactly 3 months of emergency savings left in my checking account. The sheer terror of financial ruin tightened my chest until it was genuinely hard to breathe. Yet, beneath that crushing wave of anxiety, something else began to bloom. It was a strange, undeniable sensation of absolute weightlessness. For the first time in over a decade, my phone was not buzzing with catastrophic server alerts. I was no longer holding up a collapsing empire of lies. I had lost my job, but I had kept my professional integrity completely intact. I had not let them turn me into a criminal scapegoat. Standing there in the freezing rain, shivering uncontrollably, I took a deep breath of the damp air and felt entirely, profoundly free. I stepped closer to the edge of the curb, raising my free hand into the miserable, wet air to hail a passing taxi. My fingers were growing numb, and the rain was soaking entirely through my thin leather shoes. Right at that exact moment, my cell phone vibrated violently in the damp pocket of my slacks. I balanced the cardboard box carefully on my hip and pulled the device out. I squinted through the raindrops hitting the cracked glass screen. It was an incoming call from an unknown number. The area code displayed boldly on the glowing screen was 212. It was calling directly from New York. I swiped my thumb across the wet screen and brought the freezing phone to my ear. "Hello?" I answered, my voice shaking slightly from the biting Seattle wind. "Do not get into a taxi." "Brooke," a deep, resonant voice commanded through the speaker. It was unmistakably Julian Cross. His tone was entirely unbothered by the chaos he had just orchestrated upstairs. "I am currently sitting in the lobby cafe by the south entrance. Bring your cardboard box and come back inside immediately. We have actual business to conclude." The line disconnected with a sharp click. I stood completely frozen on the wet pavement for a few seconds, the rain soaking heavily into my shoulders. Curiosity completely overrode my anxiety. I turned around, pushed back through the revolving glass doors, and walked into the expansive, heated lobby. Julian was seated calmly at a small marble table near the espresso bar. His 2 senior analysts were standing behind him, their laptops open and resting directly on the sleek counter, typing furiously. Julian took a slow sip of his black coffee and gestured for me to sit in the empty chair across from him. I placed my damp cardboard box on the floor and sat down. "You assumed I walked away from a potential $3.5 billion acquisition simply because Arthur is a lying fool?" Julian asked, his flat gray eyes locking onto mine. "I assumed you walked away because the company is entirely hollow and functionally bankrupt," I replied evenly, wiping a drop of cold rain from my forehead. Julian set his espresso cup down. A faint, razor-thin smile appeared on his face. It was the first time I had seen him display any actual emotion. "My firm does not just walk into a room blind. Brooke," Julian explained, his voice lowering into a clinical, precise cadence. "My analysts uncovered the massive discrepancies in their financial filings over a week ago. We knew about the $40 million in toxic, hidden debt. We knew the servers were failing. I merely needed Arthur to formally present the fraudulent prospectus, and I needed someone inside the company to confirm the core algorithm was externally leased. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers perfectly. The exact second we stepped out of that boardroom and into the elevator, I made a phone call to the central bank that holds Arthur's primary commercial loans. Julian continued, because Cryptexa Core has secretly missed 2 consecutive covenant payments. Their loans were flagged for immediate default. I just purchased every single cent of their matured debt for pennies on the dollar. I stared at him, the magnitude of what he was saying slowly snapping into brilliant focus. You bought their debt. I did, Julian confirmed softly, which means, as of exactly 4 minutes ago, my holding firm is the supreme secured creditor of this entire operation. I hold the absolute lifeblood of the company, and because they are in catastrophic default, I have the unilateral authority to dictate what happens next. Pick up your box. We are going back upstairs. I grab my box, my heart suddenly hammering a heavy, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. We walked past the stunned receptionist, stepping into the private executive elevator. The ride up was entirely silent, but the air was charged with electric anticipation. When the metal doors slid open on the top floor, the open plan office was still buzzing with panicked whispers. The moment Julian stepped out, followed closely by me, the entire floor went completely dead. Dozens of employees watched in absolute shock as we bypassed the cubicles and marched directly back toward the shattered glass of the boardroom. Arthur was standing in the middle of the ruined room, frantically screaming into his cell phone, trying desperately to reach his lawyers. Kinsley was sitting on the floor amidst the broken plastic of her expensive virtual reality headsets, still sobbing loudly. Arthur looked up, his face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The cell phone slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. "What is this?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking into a pathetic squeak. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "I fired her, get her out of my building." "This is no longer your building." "Arthur," Julian stated, his voice cut through the room like a heavy steel blade. 10 minutes ago, my firm executed a hostile buyout of your entire debt portfolio from the central bank. You are fundamentally insolvent. Therefore, I am officially activating the immediate collateral seizure clause." Arthur gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "I now own the servers downstairs," Julian listed methodically, pointing toward the floor. "I own the proprietary interface, I own this mahogany table, and I own the leather chair you are currently standing next to. Furthermore, due to your documented financial fraud and gross systemic sabotage, you and your niece are terminated immediately. You will receive 0 severance. You will not be allowed to pack your personal belongings." Julian snapped his fingers, looking directly at the 2 massive security guards who were still standing awkwardly by the door, the same 2 guards who had escorted me out just 20 minutes prior. "Escort these 2 individuals off my property immediately." Julian ordered the guards. "If they resist, call the police and have them arrested for corporate trespassing." The guards did not hesitate. The paycheck now clearly came from Julian. They moved in swiftly, grabbing Arthur by his expensive suit jacket and hauling Kinsley up by the arm. Kinsley shrieked, her designer heels slipping on the polished wood as she tried to pull away. Julian completely ignored their frantic shouting. He turned his back on them and looked directly at me. "I now own a severely broken company, but the core digital infrastructure can be salvaged and completely rebuilt," Julian said, his eyes scanning my face for any hesitation. "I do not need a brand manager, and I certainly do not need a visionary. I need a mechanic. I need the person who built this digital empire, who knows exactly which bricks to put back into place to make my investment profitable." He gestured toward the head of the table. "Brooke Bryant, I am officially appointing you as the new Chief Executive Officer of this company. You have absolute, unrestricted authority to restructure the entire engineering department." The entire floor of employees, who had gathered outside the shattered glass walls to watch the spectacle, erupted into stunned murmurs. I slowly put my small cardboard box down on the pristine surface of the mahogany table. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing Seattle rain evaporate completely from my skin. I walked over to the heavy leather executive chair. I turned it around smoothly and sat down, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of ultimate authority settle around me. I looked across the room at Kinsley, who was currently being dragged through the doorway by the security guard, her makeup completely destroyed and her face twisted in pure, defeated agony. I leaned forward slightly, offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile. "Remember to take your aesthetic virtual reality headsets with you," I said, my voice projecting clearly over her pathetic sobbing. "Here, we only value actual results." Thank you so much for listening to today's story on Boss Revenge Stories. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code currently on your screen or click the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment. Your support directly pays our hardworking staff, helps them feed their families, and allows us to continue bringing you the absolute best corporate revenge stories. Until next time, stay strong and never let them silence you.